Hey everybody, this is Dr. Reese Barrick welcoming you again to A New Way to Museum here at the Sternberg Museum. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the different sorts of cool questions you can answer with all of the different bones that we find in the museum. Fossil bones come from a lot of different types of animals, and some of these animals we don't know a whole heck of a lot about how they lived. The two things you really need to know about a vertebrate animal in order to know a little bit about the basics of how it lived is how big was it and what was its metabolism. Because if you know, what is metabolism anyway? Metabolism is just the amount of energy an animal burns up and needs, which talks about how much food it has to eat and how fast it's going to grow and how constant it keeps its temperature. We talk a lot about warm-blooded or cold-blooded animals, which we like to call homeotherms or ectotherms, basically meaning are they a constant body temperature or do they have fluctuating body temperatures? Well, if you know the metabolism and the size of an animal, you have a pretty good idea of sort of how much and how often it's going to have to eat, how much space it's going to need to swim around in or to walk around in, and sort of a first order of sort of how fast it's going to grow. There's lots of ways of looking at these questions, and one of them is to just try to figure out what is the temperature variability of an animal, because things that have a low metabolism generally have higher fluctuating body temperatures, and things that have a high metabolism and need lots of food generally have lower variability in their body temperatures. So the question is, how do we figure that out with just fossil bones? Well, one of the things we know about bones, if we get a cool bone up here, is that bones are made out of calcium and phosphate. Right? That's how we grow our bones big and strong, is we have to drink a lot of milk to get a lot of calcium, and our bones are made out of phosphate. Phosphate's a cool thing. It's phosphorus and oxygen. And oxygen is the key to our story today. So what is oxygen? Oxygen's a cool element, and it's where? It's in the air we breathe, right? We have to breathe it all the time in order to be alive. We find it in the water we drink or the water we swim in. Water is hydrogen and oxygen. It's our H2O. It also happens to be in our blood. So our lungs take in oxygen, give it to our blood, that transports it all around our body to help metabolize or do the metabolism of all the food we eat. Well, all of that oxygen in the air we're breathing and the water that we're drinking will end up in the phosphate in our bones. So that's where the bones in our museum come in to be sort of handy. Let's take a look at how we can measure oxygen in our bones. Well, one of the cool things I like to use are apples. Apples are kind of interesting, and if you look down here, I've got a whole bunch of apples, and you see that they're slightly different sizes. But they're all apples. As a matter of fact, they're all gala apples. There's small gala apples and large gala apples. Why is that important? Because oxygen that we breathe and in the water we drink comes in two different size forms. Oxygen 18, which is slightly larger, and oxygen 16, which is slightly smaller. So it's all oxygen, but it comes in two slightly different sizes. We call these isotopes. Atoms are made out of electrons, neutrons, and protons. So to be oxygen, you have to have 8 protons. But you could have 8 neutrons or 10 neutrons. So some oxygens are a little bit bigger than other oxygens. They're not all created equally. Most oxygen in the world is O16 or small apples. But there is a fair amount of large apple oxygen. So what's interesting is we can measure the sizes of oxygen in a bone. So what does that have to do with anything? Well, interestingly enough, if you have a bone that is growing from a small bone, getting larger and larger and larger, it's always adding phosphate, it's always adding oxygen. And it may be adding, let's play a little game here. So as the bone's growing, the blood's flowing around, and as it starts to go into the bone, the oxygen or the apples get hooked into the bone and become bone phosphate. And as the bones continue to grow, you're going to get apples of different sizes as the bone continues to grow. And here you can see that apples, the ratio of the small to large apples stayed the same as the bone's growing. As it continues to grow, the ratio might change, and now the bones just got colder because there's more large apples than there are small apples, relatively speaking, to the rest of the bone. And if it keeps growing, you might change some and get nothing but smaller apples, small galas. Now this part of the bone is actually warmer than the rest of the bone because it's all small apples. So we went cool, same temperature, warmer. Now we got a lot colder. So the ratio of the large to small apples tells you changes in body temperature from cold to warm. So that's one way we can use all of these bones in our collections to figure out whether the animals we're looking at had a high metabolism or not, whether they were sort of had constant or changing body temperatures, which tells us a lot more about the animals. Now, if we're looking at things like mammals and rhinos, we have a fairly good idea of what their metabolism is. If we're looking at snakes, we have a fairly good idea what their metabolism is. But if we're looking at things like dinosaurs, well, it takes work like this to sort of get an idea of what their metabolism might be. Or if we're looking at things like, in our museum, mosasaurs. We have a chance to look at body temperatures of mosasaurs to sort of figure out how constant their temperatures are, which gives us a better idea of whether they're on the warm-blooded end of the spectrum or whether they're on the cold-blooded end of the spectrum, which is a really cool question. And we've actually got a graduate student looking at that right now. So one of the ways we can do that is we can look at different bones in a skeleton. All right? So there's two different types of bones, well, not two different types, but as far as what we're considering is, if you look at an animal, the body core in here, where most of the mass is going to stay at an area where the guts are, the heart, the guts, is probably going to usually a little warmer than out at the tips of the toes, the end of the limbs, or out at the end of the tail. So we like to call this the extremities out here, or the body core in here. Well, if we're looking at bones, the bones of the body core are things like the vertebra, your backbones. Animals want to keep these at a fairly constant temperature because that's your nerve system. Depending on the animal, vertebrae can have different sorts of looks. And things like whales have pretty simple vertebrae. Also in the body core are rib bones, right? So rib bones are also part of the body core. So the idea is that these bones of the body core for a warm-blooded animal should have less than 4 degrees worth of temperature variability. right? So we're looking to see if the apples or the isotopes are telling us whether the bones of the body core have less than 4 degrees worth of temperature variability. If they only have 1 or 2 degrees of temperature variability, they're likely warm-blooded. On the other hand, there's also bones of the extremities. Right? Here's a leg bone, a femur that goes into the hip socket. We've got an ulna, which is an arm bone up here, or we could go all the way out and look at toe bones. So we can look at the isotopic variability of bones all the way down the extremities and see if the temperature changes. Oftentimes, even with warm-blooded animals, if they have really long limbs or they have big fins, they will get colder the further away you get from the body core. And oftentimes, with cold-blooded animals, if they're cold-blooded, the body core will go through the same range of temperatures as the extremities will, especially if they live in the water. So it's another way comparing the body core with the extremities to get an idea more of what their body temperature changes are doing and how they relate to their environment. So more cool things that you can look at, and we're trying to figure that out for mosasaurs and maybe plesiosaurs now. So the cool thing is large and small oxygen. Just think of it as large and small gala apples, and by comparing these things we can get an idea of how an animal lived. And if you spend too much time hanging out doing videos trying to talk about isotopes, you get pretty hungry, and that always helps when you got an apple around. Thanks for joining me on A New Way to Museum. We'll see you again next time.
Thanks for joining us in A New Way to Museum with the Sternberg Museum of Natural History. If you enjoyed this video, like it and subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell for notifications when we release a new video. Support us on Patreon for early access and exclusive content. You can also follow us on all our social media. Links are found in the description. Thanks for watching, and follow your curiosity to new discoveries.